Marcus Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead as he loaded the last container of emergency rations onto his transport hover cart. The scorching twin suns of Kepler 442b beat down mercilessly on the refugee camp that had become his second home over the past 6 months. As a relief coordinator for the Terran Humanitarian Corps, he had seen his share of suffering across the galaxy, but nothing quite like this. The Zephyrian refugee crisis had exploded across interstellar news feeds 3 years ago when their homeworld suffered a catastrophic environmental collapse. Millions of the insectoid aliens had fled across dozens of systems, seeking any planet that would accept them. Most worlds turned them away, citing resource shortages or incompatible atmospheric requirements. Earth, despite its own struggles, had opened its doors to several thousand Zephyrian families, though they were housed in temporary camps on frontier worlds like this one. Marcus pushed his cart through the dusty pathways between the ramshackle shelters. The Zephyrians had constructed their temporary homes using a mixture of salvaged materials and their own natural secretions that hardened into a paper-like substance. From a distance, the camp looked like a collection of enormous wasp nests scattered across the orange landscape. As he approached Sector 7, the poorest area of the camp, Marcus heard the familiar sound that had been haunting his dreams lately. It was a soft chittering, barely audible above the constant hum of atmospheric processors, but he had learned to recognize it immediately. It was the sound of hungry Zephyrian children. The adult Zephyrians stood nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms and chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed like polished amber. Their children, however, were no larger than human toddlers, with softer shells and oversized compound eyes that seemed to hold far too much intelligence for their small forms. The universal translator built into Marcus's collar piece could interpret their language, but it struggled with the emotional undertones of their communications. He stopped his cart outside a cluster of particularly run-down shelters. These housed the families who had arrived most recently, after spending months drifting through space in overcrowded transport ships. They had the least resources, the fewest possessions, and according to the camp's distribution records, the lowest priority for food allocation. "Mr. Marcus!" came a high-pitched voice through his translator. A small Zephyrian child scuttled toward him on 6 tiny legs, her shell a pale green that indicated youth and malnutrition. This was Zix-Ala, though she had asked him to call her Zixi after learning that human names were typically shorter. "Hello, Zixi," Marcus said, crouching down to her level. Even with her species' natural height advantage, she only came up to his chest when he knelt. "How are you feeling today?" The child's antennae drooped slightly. "Hungry," she said simply, and the translator somehow managed to convey the resignation in her voice. "Mama says the food distributors will come tomorrow, but they said that yesterday too." Marcus felt the familiar knot forming in his stomach. He knew the official distribution schedule by heart. And Sector 7 wasn't due for another delivery for 3 days. The camp operated on strict rationing protocols established by the Galactic Relief Coordination Committee. Every refugee received exactly 2,150 calories per day, calculated to meet the basic nutritional needs of the average Zephyrian adult. But the calculations didn't account for growing children who needed more nutrients, or for families who had to share their rations with elderly relatives whose digestive systems couldn't process the standard emergency food. "Where's your mama?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Working in the processing plant," Zixi replied. "She's been there since before the first sun rose. She won't be back until after both suns set." The processing plant was a massive industrial facility that extracted rare minerals from the planet's crust. It was dangerous work, but it was the only employment available to refugees who wanted to earn enough credits to eventually book passage off-world. The Zephyrian adults could work 12-hour shifts in conditions that would kill most species, thanks to their robust exoskeletons and redundant organ systems. Marcus looked around and spotted several other small forms hiding in the shadows of the shelters. Word had spread that he was here, and the children were emerging from their hiding spots. There was Clix, whose father had died during the journey from their homeworld. There was Vorth, whose parents were both working double shifts to save up for medical treatment for his baby sister. And there was little Quinn, who couldn't have been more than 3 years old in human equivalent, whose entire extended family had perished when their transport ship suffered a reactor breach. These children spent their days alone while the adults worked or searched for work. They had no school, no organized activities, no supervision beyond what the older children could provide. The official camp policies stated that childcare was the responsibility of individual families, not the relief organizations. But policies, Marcus had learned, were written by people who had never looked into the compound eyes of a starving alien child. He opened his cart and began pulling out standard ration packs. Each one contained a day's worth of nutrition for an adult Zephyrian, compressed into dense protein bars and vitamin supplements. He handed one to each child, watching their antennae perk up with excitement. "This is just for today," he told them, though he knew he'd be back tomorrow and the day after that. "Make sure you share with your families." Zixi clutched her ration pack against her small body. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus. Mama says humans are the only species that shares food with strangers. She says that's why your people will inherit the stars someday." Marcus smiled, though he wondered if Zixi's mother would still feel that way if she knew how little his own species was actually doing to help. Earth's contribution to the Zephyrian relief effort was modest at best, and there were already calls in the Terran Congress to reduce funding for off-world humanitarian programs. As the children scurried away with their unexpected meals, Marcus noticed he was being watched. A tall Zephyrian adult stood near one of the shelters, partially hidden in the shadows. Unlike the others in this sector, her exoskeleton had an unusual iridescent quality, shifting between deep purple and silver as she moved. Her 4 arms were crossed in a gesture that the translator indicated meant either skepticism or careful observation. Marcus had seen her before, always at a distance, always watching. She never approached the food distribution points, never registered complaints with the camp administration, never seemed to interact much with the other refugees. The children called her Aunt Thess, though none of them seemed to be directly related to her. Their eyes met for a moment across the dusty courtyard. Marcus raised his hand in greeting, but she stepped back into the shadows of her shelter. He shrugged and began pushing his empty cart back toward the main camp facility. He had learned not to take the social dynamics of alien cultures personally. What he didn't know was that Aunt Thess was actually Empress Thessarian Vexthul, the supreme ruler of the galactic Zephyrian Empire, and that she had been living in exile in this refugee camp for the past 8 months, while her enemies believed her to be dead. The Zephyrian Empire controlled over 600 star systems and commanded the loyalty of dozens of client species. Thessarian had ruled for nearly 30 standard years, guiding her people through an era of unprecedented expansion and prosperity. But empires, she had learned, were fragile things. A military coup led by her own cousin had forced her to flee the capital world with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of loyal guards. Most of those guards had died getting her to this backwater planet. The few survivors had long since departed, either killed by bounty hunters or convinced to abandon their hopeless cause. Only Thessarian remained, hiding among the very refugees she had failed to protect when the environmental disasters struck their homeworld. She had watched this human, Marcus, for weeks now. At first, she had been suspicious. Humans were a young species, barely a century into their expansion beyond their homeworld. They were known to be unpredictable, sometimes generous to a fault, sometimes ruthlessly pragmatic. But they were also politically insignificant in galactic terms. Earth commanded perhaps a dozen star systems and had no meaningful military power beyond their own borders. What could this human possibly gain by feeding refugee children? There were no cameras recording his actions for propaganda purposes, no reporters following him around to document his charity, no political advantage to be gained by showing kindness to displaced Zephyrians. His own species barely tolerated the refugees on their worlds. The Sarian had seen the camp's official records. Marcus Chen earned 3,200 credits per month as a relief coordinator. The ration packs he was giving away cost 15 credits each on the open market. By her calculations, he was spending nearly a quarter of his salary feeding children who weren't even his own species. In her 30 years of rule, Thessarian had never encountered such behavior from any species. Generosity, yes. Political maneuvering disguised as charity, absolutely. But this pure, inexplicable kindness toward alien children served no purpose she could identify. She thought about her own children, safe in hidden locations throughout the galaxy, protected by loyal military units that still believed in her cause. They had never known hunger, never known fear, never had to worry about where their next meal would come from. These refugee children were experiencing everything her own offspring had been spared, and this human stranger was the only thing standing between them and starvation. As evening fell and the twin suns disappeared below the horizon, Thessarian made a decision. Tomorrow, she would approach this Marcus Chen, not as an empress, not as a political leader, but as another refugee curious about the motivations of an inexplicably generous human. She had no idea that this simple decision would eventually change the course of galactic history. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Sector 7 earlier than usual. He had been unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of hungry children and empty ration supplies. His supervisor had begun asking pointed questions about discrepancies in the inventory records, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before his unauthorized food distributions were discovered. He was surprised to find Thessarian waiting for him near the entrance to the sector. In the pale light of dawn, her exoskeleton looked almost silver, and he could see intricate patterns etched into its surface that suggested either high social rank or significant age. "You are the human who feeds the young ones," she said, and her voice through the translator carried an odd formal quality that Marcus hadn't heard from other refugees. "I try to help when I can," Marcus replied carefully. He had learned to be cautious around refugees who seemed too interested in his activities. Camp politics could be complicated, and he didn't want to get caught up in disputes between different factions. "Why?" Thessarian asked simply. The question caught Marcus off guard. In his 6 months at the camp, no one had ever asked him directly why he shared his rations with the children. They had thanked him, blessed him, offered to work for him, but never questioned his motivations. "Because they're hungry," he said, then realized how inadequate that answer sounded. Because no child should have to go to sleep with an empty stomach, regardless of what species they belong to. Thessarian's antennae twitched in a pattern that indicated deep thought. "Your species gains nothing from this generosity. The Zephyrian refugees have no political power, no resources to offer in return. We are, as you humans might say, a poor investment." Marcus found himself smiling despite the serious tone of the conversation. "I don't think of children as investments. They're just children. They didn't choose to be here. They didn't choose to lose their homes or their families. They're innocent. Innocence is a luxury most species abandon when survival is at stake," Thessarian observed. "Yet you risk your own position, your own resources, for alien children who cannot repay you." "Maybe that's what makes us human," Marcus said, then immediately felt embarrassed by how pompous that sounded. "I mean, maybe that's what makes us who we are. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, or the smartest, or the most advanced. But we try to take care of each other, even when it doesn't make logical sense." Thessarian was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those huge compound eyes. Finally, she said, "I have lived for many cycles, human Marcus. I have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars. I have witnessed acts of great cruelty and occasional mercy. But I have never encountered a species that defines itself by its willingness to sacrifice for strangers." "We're not perfect," Marcus admitted. "We have wars, we have poverty, we have people who only care about themselves. But most of us try to do the right thing when we can." As if summoned by their conversation, the children began emerging from their shelters. Zixi was first, as always, followed by the others in their usual order. They moved cautiously when they saw Thessarian standing next to Marcus, unsure if this meant good news or bad news for their daily feeding routine. Marcus opened his cart and began distributing ration packs, as he had every morning for the past 3 weeks. But this time, Thessarian stepped forward and knelt down next to little Quinn, the orphaned 3-year-old who always hung back from the group. "Hello, small one," she said gently, and something in her voice made the universal translator add emotional subtitles that Marcus had never seen before. Affection, protectiveness, sorrow. Quinn's eyes widened with surprise, but she moved closer to Thessarian. The older Zephyrian reached out and gently stroked the child's soft shell with one delicate hand. "Are you hungry, little star?" Thessarian asked, using an endearment that made several of the other children gasp with recognition. "Always hungry," Quinn whispered. "But Mr. Marcus brings food. He makes the hurt in my belly go away." Thessarian looked up at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You have made yourself precious to them," she said quietly. "They trust you completely." "I just try to be reliable," Marcus replied. "Children need to know that someone will be there for them." As the children scattered with their rations, Thessarian stood up slowly. "There is something you should know about me, human Marcus. Something important." "What's that?" "I am not who I appear to be. My true identity could bring great danger to this camp, to these children, to you. But watching you these past weeks has taught me something about honor that I had forgotten in my years of wielding power." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "Soon you will understand. And when that time comes, I hope you will remember that even empires can learn from the kindness of strangers." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Thessarian turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of shelters like a silver ghost. He stood there for a long moment, staring after her, wondering what he had gotten himself into. High above the planet's surface, a sleek warship dropped out of hyperspace and began scanning the surface for signs of life. Its captain had been hunting the same target for 8 months, following cold trails across dozens of star systems. But this time, they had received intelligence from a reliable source. The Empress was here. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed after his conversation with Thessarian. Over the next few days, he noticed subtle shifts in the behavior of the refugees throughout Sector 7. Adults who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully when he passed. Children who had been shy began approaching him with small gifts, polished stones, woven grass bracelets, tiny sculptures carved from salvaged metal. Most strangely, the chronic food shortage that had plagued Sector 7 for months seemed to be mysteriously resolving itself. When Marcus arrived for his daily distributions, he found that many families already had adequate supplies. Not abundance, but enough to keep the children fed without his intervention. "Where is all this food coming from?" he asked Zixi during one of their morning conversations. The little girl's antennae twitched in a pattern he had learned indicated mild confusion. "Aunt Thess says her friends in other sectors are sharing their extra rations. She says it's important that you see how grateful we are for everything you've done." Marcus frowned. He knew the camp's demographics intimately after 6 months of work, and there were no other sectors with surplus food to share. Every refugee family was operating on the same bare minimum allocation, yet somehow Sector 7 was no longer on the brink of starvation. His questions were answered 3 days later when alarms began blaring across the entire camp. Marcus was in the main administrative building, filing his daily reports, when the emergency sirens activated. Through the reinforced windows, he could see security personnel running toward the landing pads where several sleek ships had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "All personnel to secure stations," came the announcement over the facility's communication system. "We have unidentified vessels requesting permission to land. This is not a drill." But these weren't typical refugee transport ships. Marcus could see that much even from a distance. These vessels were military-grade, with the kind of advanced shielding and weapon systems that only major galactic powers could afford. Their hulls bore markings he didn't recognize, but the design aesthetic was unmistakably Zephyrian. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the camp's chief administrator, burst into the records office where Marcus was working. Her usually composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "Marcus, I need you to get to Sector 7 immediately," she said, her voice tight with stress. "We have a situation developing, and apparently you're the only staff member some of the refugees will talk to." "What kind of situation?" "The ships that just landed are from the Zephyrian Imperial Navy. They're not here for humanitarian purposes. They're looking for someone specific, and they seem to think that someone is hiding in our camp." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Who are they looking for?" "Someone calling themselves Empress Thessarian Vexthul. According to their records, she's the missing ruler of the entire Zephyrian Empire. Apparently, there's been a galaxy-wide manhunt going on for months." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Thessarian?" he whispered. "You know that name?" "Aunt Thess," Marcus said, his mind racing. "The refugees in Sector 7 call her Aunt Thess. She's been living there for months. I've been talking to her almost daily." Dr. Martinez stared at him. "You've been talking to the missing Empress of the Zephyrian Empire? Marcus, do you understand what this means? If she's really here, if she's been hiding among the refugees, it means she's been watching me feed her people's children for weeks," Marcus finished, "and I had no idea who she was." The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Through the office door came 6 figures in elaborate military armor, their exoskeletons polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with rank insignia that even Marcus could recognize as indicating very high positions in the military hierarchy. The lead figure removed his helmet, revealing a scarred and battle-worn face that somehow managed to convey both authority and exhaustion. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of weight that only came from years of commanding soldiers in life-or-death situations. "I am General Voxthul, commander of the Imperial Fleet, and cousin to Empress Thessarian. I am here to retrieve my Empress and return her to the throne that is rightfully hers." Dr. Martinez stepped forward, trying to maintain her professional composure. "General, I assure you that our camp operates under strict galactic refugee protection protocols. We cannot simply hand over any individual without proper documentation and legal proceedings." General Voxthul's antennae flattened against his skull in a gesture that Marcus had learned indicated impatience or anger. "Dr. Martinez, you misunderstand the situation. I am not here as an enemy. I am here as a loyal subject who has spent 8 months searching for his rightful ruler. The coup that forced the Empress into exile has been defeated. The traitors have been executed. The Empire needs its legitimate leader to return." "And if this person doesn't want to return?" Marcus found himself asking, stepping forward despite his better judgment. All 6 military figures turned to stare at him. General Voxthul's compound eyes focused on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. "You are the human," the general said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't a question. "The one who has been feeding our children." "I've been helping where I could," Marcus replied carefully. "My Empress has been sending regular reports about the conditions in this camp. She has mentioned your unprecedented generosity to our youngest refugees. She has spoken of you with great respect." Marcus blinked in surprise. "She's been sending reports? Did you think the ruler of 600 star systems would simply disappear without maintaining contact with her loyal forces? Empress Thessarian has been coordinating the resistance movement from this camp for months. Her exile was never permanent. It was strategic." The implications of this revelation hit Marcus like a tidal wave. Thessarian hadn't been hiding in shame or defeat. She had been operating a shadow government from a refugee camp, using her position among the displaced to gather intelligence and coordinate with her remaining allies. "Where is she now?" Dr. Martinez asked. General Voxthul gestured toward the windows. "In Sector 7, saying farewell to the children she has grown to care for during her time here. She has asked specifically to speak with the human Marcus before her departure." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself walking through Sector 7, accompanied by an entire squad of Imperial Guards. The contrast between the ramshackle refugee shelters and the gleaming military armor was surreal, like something from a badly edited science fiction film. The children of Sector 7 had gathered in the central courtyard, but their usual enthusiasm was nowhere to be seen. They clustered together in small groups, their antennae drooping with confusion and fear. The arrival of military forces in their sector clearly meant that something significant was happening, though Marcus doubted any of them understood exactly what. Thessarian stood in the center of the courtyard, and Marcus was shocked by the transformation in her appearance. Gone was the modest, somewhat shabby refugee he had been speaking with for weeks. In her place stood someone who radiated authority and power, despite wearing the same simple clothing she had always worn. Her posture was different, her movements more deliberate, her entire presence somehow larger than it had been before. But when little Zixi approached her, Marcus saw the same gentle affection in her gestures that he had observed during their morning conversations. "Aunt Thess," Zixi said in a small voice, "are you going away?" Thessarian knelt down so she could look directly into the child's compound eyes. "Yes, little star. I must return to my responsibilities. But I will never forget the lessons I learned here, or the kindness shown to our people by unexpected friends." She looked up at Marcus as she said this, and he saw something in her expression that made him realize just how profoundly their interactions had affected her. "General Voxthul tells me you've been coordinating resistance operations from here," Marcus said, "that you've been planning your return to power all along." Thessarian stood slowly, never breaking eye contact. "That is true, but it is not the whole truth." She gestured to the children around them. "When I first arrived here, I was consumed with rage and plans for revenge. I thought only of reclaiming my throne and punishing those who had betrayed me. I saw these refugees as tools to be used, resources to be managed." "What changed?" "You changed, Marcus Chen. Your daily acts of inexplicable kindness forced me to remember why I wanted to rule in the first place. An empire that cannot protect its most vulnerable citizens is not worth preserving. A leader who cannot see the value in alien children is not worthy of power." General Voxthul stepped forward. "My Empress, the fleet is ready for departure. The sooner we return to the capital, the sooner we can begin implementing the reforms you have outlined." Thessarian nodded, but she kept her attention focused on Marcus. "I have a proposal for you, human Marcus. The Zephyrian Empire is about to undergo significant changes. We will need advisors who understand the true meaning of humanitarian service. We will need examples of the kind of selfless leadership that transcends species boundaries. What are you asking? I am asking you to come with me, to serve as Earth's first official ambassador to the Zephyrian Empire, to help me build a government that protects the weak rather than exploiting them. Marcus looked around at the children who had gathered to watch this surreal conversation. Zixi was holding on to Thessarian's leg, clearly unwilling to let her go. Clix and Vorth stood together near one of the shelters, their young faces reflecting confusion about why their daily source of food was suddenly surrounded by military officers. "What about them?" Marcus asked. "What about all the refugees still living in camps like this one?" Thessarian smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, Marcus saw genuine joy in her expression. "That, Ambassador Chen, will be your first official assignment. You will oversee the resettlement of every Zephyrian refugee currently displaced by the environmental disaster. You will ensure that no Zephyrian child ever goes hungry again while their people possess the means to feed them." "I don't know anything about interstellar diplomacy," Marcus protested. "You know about kindness," Thessarian replied. "You know about sacrifice for the greater good. You know about treating alien children as if they were your own. These are qualities that no diplomatic academy can teach." She turned to address the children directly. "Young ones, Mr. Marcus has shown us what it means to be truly civilized. He has demonstrated that the greatest strength is not the ability to conquer, but the wisdom to care for others without expectation of reward." Zixi tugged on Thessarian's clothing. "Will we see Mr. Marcus again?" "Oh, little star," Thessarian said, lifting the child up in her forearms. "You will see him again very soon. And when you do, he will be helping to make sure that no refugee child anywhere in the galaxy has to worry about being hungry." As the Imperial Guards began escorting Thessarian toward the landing pad where their ships waited, Marcus felt a profound sense of vertigo. 12 hours ago, he had been a relief coordinator struggling to feed a handful of alien children with his own rations. Now he was apparently being offered a position as an interstellar ambassador. "This is insane," he muttered to himself. Dr. Martinez appeared at his elbow. "Marcus, do you understand what just happened here? The Empress of the largest alien empire in this sector of the galaxy just offered you a position that could reshape human-alien relations for generations. I understand that a woman I thought was a refugee just revealed that she's been using our camp as a base of operations for a revolution," Marcus replied. "I understand that children I've been feeding are apparently the subjects of an interstellar empire. I understand that nothing about my life makes sense anymore. So what are you going to do?" Marcus watched as Thessarian's ship prepared for takeoff. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see her looking back toward Sector 7, toward the children who were waving goodbye to their Aunt Thess. "I'm going to do what I've always done," he said finally. "I'm going to try to help where I can." 3 hours later, Marcus Chen found himself aboard an Imperial Zephyrian warship, traveling toward a distant capital world he had only heard about in history classes. His few personal possessions were stored in a cabin that was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, and he was wearing diplomatic credentials that gave him more authority than he had ever wanted. But before leaving the refugee camp, he had made Thessarian promise him one thing: that his first official act as ambassador would be authorizing emergency food shipments to every refugee camp in the sector. Some promises, Marcus had learned, were worth reshaping an empire to keep. 6 months after leaving the refugee camp, Ambassador Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, looking out over the sprawling capital city of the Zephyrian Empire. The view still took his breath away. Crystalline spires reached toward the purple sky like frozen music, connected by graceful bridges that defied human understanding of engineering. Millions of Zephyrians moved through the aerial walkways like coordinated dancers, their iridescent shells catching the light of 3 different suns. It was beautiful, efficient, and completely alien. Marcus still felt like an imposter every time he walked through the palace corridors in his formal diplomatic robes. "Ambassador Chen," came a familiar voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Thessarian approaching, though he still had trouble thinking of her as Empress, despite the elaborate crown that now adorned her head and the flowing ceremonial garments that marked her imperial status. "Your Majesty," Marcus replied, offering the slight bow that protocol demanded. Even after months of instruction from the palace etiquette masters, he still felt awkward with the formal gestures. "How many times must I tell you to call me Thessarian when we are speaking privately?" she said, moving to stand beside him at the observation window. "The human who fed hungry children in a refugee camp has earned the right to use my personal name." Marcus smiled. Despite her return to absolute power, Thessarian had retained the directness and warmth he had first encountered in Sector 7. "Old habits," he said. "Besides, your advisors keep reminding me that proper protocol is important for interspecies relations." "My advisors worry too much about maintaining appearances," Thessarian replied. "They fail to understand that true authority comes from serving others, not from demanding their submission." Through the window, they could see construction crews working on massive new buildings in the lower districts of the city. These were the resettlement centers that would house the returning refugees from camps across the galaxy. The first groups had already arrived, including many of the families from Sector 7. "The latest reports from the refugee resettlement program," Thessarian said, handing Marcus a data tablet. "Thanks to your coordination efforts, we have successfully relocated 1.2 million displaced Zephyrians to permanent housing across our core worlds. Unemployment among former refugees has dropped to less than 3%, and childhood malnutrition has been completely eliminated." Marcus scrolled through the statistics, still amazed by what they had accomplished. "What about the other species? The non-Zephyrian refugees who were also affected by the environmental disasters?" "That brings me to the reason I wanted to speak with you today," Thessarian said, and Marcus could hear excitement in her voice. "The Galactic Council has formally requested that the Zephyrian Empire serve as the coordinating body for all refugee relief efforts in this sector. They want us to extend our resettlement programs to displaced populations of every species." Marcus looked up from the tablet. That's enormous. The logistics alone would be incredibly complex." "Yes," Thessarian agreed. "Which is why I need my most capable ambassador to take charge of the entire operation." "Me? Thessarian, I'm still figuring out how to navigate Zephyrian bureaucracy. How am I supposed to coordinate relief efforts for dozens of different species across hundreds of star systems?" Thessarian's antennae moved in the pattern that Marcus had learned, indicated amusement. "Do you remember what you told me in the refugee camp? About how humans define themselves by their willingness to sacrifice for strangers?" "That was just one conversation. I was probably being overly dramatic." "That conversation changed the course of galactic history, Marcus. The principles you demonstrated in that camp have become the foundation for everything we have built since my return to power." She gestured toward the construction projects visible through the window. "Before my exile, the Zephyrian Empire was focused primarily on expansion and resource acquisition. We were powerful, but we were not good neighbors. We demanded tribute from client species, exploited their natural resources, and ignored their suffering when it was not directly profitable to intervene. And now? Now we lead by example rather than by force. We offer aid without expectation of political favor. We protect the vulnerable because it is the right thing to do, not because it advances our strategic interests." Marcus had seen the changes throughout the Empire during his months as ambassador. Trade agreements that had previously favored only Zephyrian interests were being renegotiated to ensure fair terms for all parties. Military interventions that had once been launched to secure strategic resources were now focused on protecting civilian populations from pirates and raiders. The imperial bureaucracy, which had been notorious for its corruption and inefficiency, was being rebuilt from the ground up with transparency and accountability as core principles. The other galactic powers are calling it the human doctrine, Thessarian continued. The idea that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than holding them down. Several smaller empires have already begun implementing similar reforms in their own territories. That seems like a lot of credit to give to one conversation between a relief worker and a refugee, Marcus said. Actions have consequences that ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict, Thessarian replied. Your daily choice to feed hungry children with no expectation of reward or recognition demonstrated a form of moral courage that most species have never encountered. It forced me to examine my own motivations and priorities. A soft chime from Marcus's communication device interrupted their conversation. He glanced at the screen and saw an incoming transmission from Dr. Sarah Martinez back at the refugee camp. Go ahead and take it, Thessarian said. I know you still worry about the families we left behind. Marcus activated the holographic display, and Dr. Martinez's tired but smiling face appeared in front of them. Marcus, perfect timing. I wanted to give you an update on our new arrivals. New arrivals? We just received 3 transport ships carrying refugees from the Altarian system. Their homeworld was hit by some kind of plague that made their agricultural zones uninhabitable. The ships are carrying about 2,000 individuals, mostly families with young children. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied news of displaced populations. What do they need? The usual: food, medical attention, temporary housing while we process their asylum requests. But here's the interesting part. They specifically requested to be brought to this camp because they heard about the human feeding protocol. Marcus blinked in surprise. The what? Dr. Martinez grinned. Apparently, word has spread through the refugee networks about a human relief worker who shares his own food with alien children. These families traveled 6 weeks longer than necessary to get here because they believed their kids would be safe under your protection. Thessarian placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. You see, your actions in Sector 7 were not isolated incidents. They were the beginning of something much larger. But I'm not even there anymore, Marcus protested. I can't help these new refugees the same way I helped the Zephyrian children. You don't need to, Dr. Martinez said. The camp administration has officially adopted your feeding protocols as standard operating procedure. Every child in every sector now receives supplemental nutrition beyond the basic allocation. We've also established educational programs and supervised playgroups modeled after the informal community you built in Sector 7. How are you funding all of this? Dr. Martinez's grin widened. Empress Thessarian's government has provided a grant that covers operational expenses for the next 10 years. Apparently, she was quite insistent that this camp become a model for refugee care throughout the galaxy. Marcus turned to look at Thessarian, who was trying unsuccessfully to appear innocent. You didn't mention that part. I may have neglected to include some details in our budget discussions, Thessarian admitted. I felt it was important to ensure that your original work could continue even in your absence. The communication from Dr. Martinez ended with promises to send regular updates about the new refugees and their children. As the hologram faded, Marcus found himself staring out the window again, watching the endless flow of traffic through the aerial highways. I keep expecting to wake up and find out this is all some kind of elaborate dream, he said finally. 6 months ago, I was filing paperwork and trying to stretch emergency rations to feed hungry kids. Now I'm apparently helping to reshape interstellar politics. The paperwork was never the important part, Thessarian observed. What mattered was your refusal to accept that hunger and suffering were inevitable. You saw a problem that the official systems couldn't or wouldn't address, and you found a way to solve it yourself. It wasn't a grand gesture. I just couldn't stand watching children go hungry when I had the means to help. That is exactly what made it grand, Thessarian replied. Grand gestures are easy when the whole galaxy is watching, and you know you will be remembered for your actions. Quiet kindness, performed without audience or expectation of reward, is the rarest form of heroism. A soft knock on the observation deck door interrupted their conversation. One of Thessarian's advisors entered and bowed respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty, Ambassador Chen, the Galactic Council representatives have arrived for the Refugee Coordination Conference. They are requesting a preliminary meeting to discuss the scope and structure of the proposed relief programs." Marcus felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that accompanied high-level diplomatic meetings. Even after months of training, he still felt unprepared for negotiations that could affect millions of lives across dozens of star systems. "Ambassador Chen," Thessarian said formally, "are you ready to expand your feeding protocol to encompass the entire galaxy?" Marcus thought about little Zixi and the other children from Sector 7, who were now safely housed in the resettlement centers he could see through the observation window. He thought about the Altarian refugees who had specifically sought out his former camp because they had heard about a human who cared for alien children. He thought about the millions of displaced individuals throughout the galaxy who were still living in overcrowded camps, still wondering where their next meal would come from. "Let's go feed some hungry kids," he said. 2 hours later, Marcus found himself sitting at a conference table with representatives from 17 different galactic civilizations. The Andromedans were tall and graceful, with luminescent blue skin that pulsed gently as they spoke. The Centaurians resembled enormous spiders, their 8 legs delicately manipulating holographic data displays. The Vegan delegation consisted of energy beings who had to use mechanical translators to communicate with matter-based species. Despite their vast differences in appearance and culture, every representative at the table had heard the same stories about the Zephyrian Empire's humanitarian reforms and the human principles that had inspired them. "Ambassador Chen," said the lead Andromedan representative, "we understand that you were personally responsible for developing the protocols that have made the Zephyrian refugee resettlement program so successful. We would like to understand how these methods could be adapted for use with other species." Marcus looked around the table at the assembled diplomats. Each one represented civilizations that were older, more advanced, and more powerful than humanity. Their combined territories encompassed thousands of star systems and trillions of sentient beings. The decisions made in this room would affect the lives of refugees across half the galaxy. "The protocols aren't really complicated," Marcus began. "They're based on a very simple principle. Every individual, regardless of species or origin, deserves to have their basic needs met: food, shelter, medical care, education for their children, and the opportunity to build a meaningful life." "These are admirable goals," said one of the Centaurian delegates. "But surely you understand the resource allocation challenges involved in providing such comprehensive support to displaced populations." "I understand that it costs money and requires organization," Marcus replied. "But I also understand that the cost of not helping is much higher. Desperate people become radicalized. Hungry children grow up to be adults who remember which civilizations helped them and which civilizations ignored them. Today's refugee is tomorrow's citizen, soldier, scientist, or leader." The Vegan representative's translator produced a series of melodic tones. "The human presents an interesting perspective on long-term strategic thinking. However, our analysis suggests that the resources required for galaxy-wide implementation would be prohibitive." Thessarian leaned forward slightly. "Perhaps it would be helpful if Ambassador Chen explained how the Zephyrian Empire has managed to fund our expanded humanitarian programs while simultaneously increasing our economic growth and military readiness." Marcus had been hoping to avoid this topic, but he could see that the other delegates were genuinely curious about the financial mechanics of their reforms. "It turns out that taking care of people is actually good business," he said. "When you educate refugee children, You get adults who can contribute to your economy. When you provide health care and nutrition, you get healthy workers. When you treat displaced populations with dignity and respect, you get citizens who are loyal to your government rather than resentful of it. You are suggesting that humanitarian programs pay for themselves through increased productivity and social stability? Asked the Andromedan. I'm suggesting that humanitarian programs are an investment in the future rather than just an expense, Marcus clarified. The Zephyrian Empire has seen economic growth of 12% since we began the refugee resettlement programs. Crime rates have dropped, military recruitment has increased, and we've gained access to new technologies and cultural innovations brought by the refugees themselves. The meeting continued for 3 more hours as the delegates worked through the practical details of establishing a galaxy-wide refugee support network. Marcus found himself increasingly comfortable in the role of advocate and advisor, drawing on his experience with individual families to illustrate broader policy principles. When the conference finally adjourned, the assembled representatives had agreed to establish a joint task force that would develop standardized protocols for refugee assistance across all member civilizations. The Zephyrian Empire would serve as the coordinating authority, with Marcus as the primary liaison responsible for ensuring that the new programs maintained their focus on individual dignity and family welfare. As the delegates filed out of the conference room, the Andromedan representative approached Marcus directly. Ambassador Chen, there is something I would like to discuss with you privately, she said. My government has been monitoring the changes in Zephyrian policy since Empress Thessarian's return to power. We have been particularly interested in the philosophical foundations of these reforms. What would you like to know? We would like to know if you believe these principles could be successfully implemented by species other than humans. The concept of sacrificing immediate gain for the welfare of strangers is not common in galactic politics. Marcus considered the question carefully. I think most species are capable of kindness when they choose to be. The challenge isn't teaching people to care about others. The challenge is creating systems that reward caring instead of punishing it. That is a profound observation, the Andromedan said. My government would like to formally request that you serve as a consultant for our own humanitarian reform initiatives. We believe that the human doctrine could be adapted for implementation within the Andromedan Confederation. I would be honored to help, Marcus replied, but I should probably mention that I'm still not entirely sure what the human doctrine actually is. I keep hearing people talk about it like it's some kind of comprehensive philosophy, but from my perspective, I was just trying to feed hungry kids. The Andromedan's luminescent skin pulsed in a pattern that Marcus had learned indicated thoughtful contemplation. Perhaps that is precisely what makes it so powerful. Grand philosophical systems are easy to argue with and difficult to implement. But the simple choice to feed hungry children is both undeniably moral and immediately practical. Later that evening, Marcus stood once again on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace. The 3 suns had set, and the city below was illuminated by the soft glow of bioluminescent streetlights and the navigation beacons of countless flying vehicles. Thessarian joined him, as had become their custom after particularly challenging diplomatic days. How do you think the conference went? She asked. Better than I expected, Marcus admitted. I was afraid they would think our programs were too expensive or too idealistic to work on a galactic scale. And instead? Instead, they want to copy everything we've done and expand it to cover refugee populations from species we've never even heard of. They want me to help design assistance programs for civilizations I can't pronounce and children who might not even be carbon-based. Thessarian's antennae moved in her characteristic expression of amusement. Are you having second thoughts about accepting their requests? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the graceful flow of traffic through the aerial highways. Somewhere down in the resettlement districts, families who had once lived in overcrowded refugee camps were settling into permanent homes. Children who had once gone to sleep hungry were now attending schools and learning skills that would allow them to build meaningful lives. "No," he said finally. "I'm not having second thoughts. I'm just amazed by how much has changed since that first morning when I decided to share my rations with Zixi and the other kids." "Do you miss it?" the Sarian asked. "The simplicity of working directly with individual families instead of coordinating policies that affect millions?" "Sometimes," Marcus said honestly. There was something satisfying about being able to solve a child's hunger immediately, right in the moment, without having to navigate bureaucracies and budgets and interstellar politics. But this way we can solve hunger for thousands of children instead of just a few. We can build systems that will still be protecting refugee families long after we're gone. We can teach other civilizations that taking care of vulnerable populations isn't just morally right. It's also strategically smart. The Sarian nodded slowly. "The day we met in Sector 7, you told me that humans try to take care of each other even when it doesn't make logical sense. You said that was what made your species who they are." "I remember. I have been thinking about that conversation for months. I believe you were wrong about one thing." Marcus turned to look at her. "What's that?" "It does make logical sense. Kindness is not an inefficiency or a luxury that civilizations can afford only when they are prosperous and secure. Kindness is the foundation that makes prosperity and security possible in the first place." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city and thinking about hungry children who would go to sleep with full stomachs, in warm beds, in homes where they were safe and loved. In refugee camps across the galaxy, relief workers were implementing new protocols that ensured no child would be denied food while adults had the means to provide it. Diplomatic missions were being planned that would establish permanent humanitarian partnerships between species that had barely spoken to each other before. And somewhere in the vast network of interstellar communication relays, messages were being transmitted that carried a simple but revolutionary idea: that the measure of a civilization's greatness was not the size of its territory or the power of its military, but its willingness to sacrifice for the welfare of strangers. It had all started with a human relief worker who couldn't bear to watch alien children go hungry, and it was only the beginning.